Okay, so plan B, I'll start from the most current. So I'm going to start by we've heard this narrative. I'm going to start with January. I'm going to go backwards. And the narrative that emerged, the Israeli narrative that emerged in the most recent attacks against Gaza, a narrative that was largely adopted by the mass media, at least initially, it went something like this. Something like this. Hamas cannot be reasoned with. It's a terrorist organization of the worst kind. It is Al-Haddad, Hamasistan, all these, whatever adjectives you can put in there. 2, the Palestinians could have made Gaza heaven on earth. We left Gaza, what more did they want? They could have made Gaza heaven on earth, and they squandered this opportunity, as they squander every opportunity. And instead, they chose terror. They are complicit because they don't prevent the firing of rockets, but at the same time, because we are an enlightened occupation, we are doing this for their benefit. We want to rid them of this terrorist regime. 3, judging by their support, as I mentioned, or lack of opposition, all Gazans support the firing of these rockets. 4, a sovereign state is responsible for protecting its citizens. And, the whole 8 years of rockets, enough is enough, any democratic nation would do the same. That war is not the answer, but peace is not possible with an organization dedicated to your destruction. 5, collateral damage is always the casualty of war, and Hamas is using the Gaza civilian population as human shields, so the innocent lives, we regret them, blah, 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 but, nothing we can do about it. 6, we cannot wait for the Palestinians to decide what they want while they're, quibbling and they're infighting. In the meanwhile, suffer their violence. So if they want to play dirty, we'll show them dirty. And so this is sort of the narrative that unfolded. Oh, and one final very important one. That, sort of summing up all of these, that it is then ultimately Palestinian violence, rather than Israeli occupation, siege, colonization, and violence, that are the stumbling blocks, ultimately, to ending both the Gaza blockade and the occupation as a whole. And this is a theme that, John talked about it a little bit, I'll talk about it some more, that is not new. It's something that it shapes the overall Israeli policy towards the Palestinian for years. This policy, and this is something that has come up also, what I'm going to do now is sort of begin to deconstruct these. Something that comes up in reference as well to these 3 conditions that we continuously hear about Palestinians having to renounce violence. I had a little thing circled about what Clinton said today in her marathon meetings with all the various Israeli leaders, and she said something like, any nation, including Israel, would be forced to do the same to respond to rocket attacks landing on it. And so again, it's always this issue of Palestinian violence, or Palestinians, or the people who are actually under occupation. It's in reverse, who have the legal enshrined right to resist, are the ones that are ultimately, the burden is on them to end all of this, to move forward. So this, number 1, and as well as two other sort of themes, have come to shape Israeli policy. The second is politicide. Politicide, for those of you not familiar, defined by the late Israeli sociologist Baruch Kimmerling as the gradual but systematic attempt to cause the annihilation of an independent political and social entities, crushing the Palestinian resistance, crushing the Palestinian national will, making a viable Palestinian state impossible to achieve. And it is with this in mind that we continuously hear the no partner refrain. So, I began with this Israeli narrative and all of it in reference to the current democratically elected government Hamas, but it is something that, in fact, has, again, shaped Israeli policy for years and years, and including in the beginning, before the disengagement, as a matter of fact, when it was first Arafat, after Camp David, and then Abbas, and many will recall that famous "there is no Palestinian partner" refrain. The same kinds of targets that were being bombed by the Israelis. It was not, as they referred to it, in self-defense, whatever it was this time, rockets at that time. It's always been civilian infrastructure, an infrastructure of law and governance. So in the early 2000s, they were hitting police stations, at that time the Palestinian Authority run by Fatah, police stations, prisons, things like this. And then now in January, same thing. The first target were 40 young policemen graduating in their ceremony, followed by the ministries, government buildings, the parliament. All in an effort, again, to collapse the infrastructure, the Palestinian infrastructure of law and governance, and create this vacuum. And again, further postpone the establishment of the Palestinian state. And that brings me to number 3, that in fact there has never been an intention. Never been an intention or a desire to create a Palestinian state. Very significantly, Oslo Accords never mention a Palestinian state, only talk about limited Palestinian self-rule. And again, as many may know, that Likud charter specifically states that it flatly rejects the establishment of a Palestinian state. And those who do, the supposed leftists or whatever, as John Stewart and others call them, talk about the necessity of a Palestinian state. What they refer to, as John said, is not an actual viable Palestinian state, but rather this sort of fragmented pseudo state that is completely non-viable, cut off from itself and from the outside world. So these three concepts are the ones that have come to shape the Israeli policy, and from there I'm going to kind of go backwards. In 2003, I finished my graduate studies. I moved back to Gaza. I got an opportunity to work, to be a stringer for, at that point, it was a newly established Al Jazeera English website. Before the TV, they had the website for 3 years running. I'm from Gaza. I have a Gaza residence. The Hawiyya, this infamous Hawiyya, the ID card that Israelis began issuing in 1967, when they ran a population census after they occupied the territories, was their way of controlling the movement of Palestinians and the beginning of the apartheid system. So if you were not there or not present during that time in 1967, Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, you lost your right, your own right to go back. So as though I would say to you after this talk, you can't go back to wherever, Bay Street, that's it. You're not a resident, you're not a citizen, a national of that area, find somewhere else to go. My parents were studying in Egypt, but because they needed doctors, they were allowed back in. They got their Hawiyyas. I got that from them. The only way you can get a Hawiyya, by the way, is if you have parents who have it, if you were born there, and it's all subject to Israeli approval. But if your spouse, for example, is not a resident, does not have the Hawiyya, or if you were not there at the time, you don't have it, you're a refugee, you should be able to get family reunification. But again, that's subject to Israeli approval. And all within this system, this matrix of control and apartheid, the way that Israelis control Palestinian movement. So we were lucky. So on a yearly basis, my parents worked in the Arabian Gulf for a long time before retiring in Gaza. And every year we would go back and we would have to renew our Hawiyya, because without doing so at that time, we would lose our Hawiyya. And again, we could not go back to Gaza. So it's a sort of yearly torturous journey across the border crossings. At that point, it was the Allenby Bridge. Then it became Rafah crossing. Strip searches and the whole shebang. And we were very young, obviously, didn't understand why we had to endure this, just to go back to this really, at that time, what we thought of an awful place. Always, curfews and always, strikes and this and that and light ammunition. And again, you get this understanding as your identity is built. And my father, sort of his own, what I saw as his own quiet resistance, he's a very apolitical man, is making sure we maintained our right to go back. Now, this policy still is in place in East Jerusalem today. As an East Jerusalemite, if you're not there for a certain number of years, if you come to study in Canada and then you couldn't go back for whatever reason, to renew your residency, you can't go back to East Jerusalem. This law does not apply to the Jewish residents of the city, by the way. So the same kind of things that were applying to us in Gaza in the 80s and the 90s still apply in Jerusalem. So I went back, I just sort of dove right in. It was the middle of the second Intifada, what at that time was dubbed Operation Rainbow in Rafah, in southern Gaza. And it was, is it up? So it was in an effort to, as would later be reported in an extensive study by Human Rights Watch called Raising Rafah, an effort to create this buffer zone under the guise of actually targeting tunnels and so forth, but they found it was a systematic attempt, a systematic house demolitions to create this buffer zone in southern Gaza. It was dubbed Operation Rainbow. And again, remember, at this time it was Fatah in power, it was not Hamas, but the same kinds of policies were in place. The result was 19,000 Palestinians lost their homes, many of them becoming twice and 3 times over refugees.